People think Washington is built out of marble and laws, but that's only what it lets outsiders see. The real city is constructed from routines, quiet agreements, and the shared understanding that some questions are better left unasked. I learned that early in my career, long before the badge lost its shine and the word closure stopped meaning anything at all. Washington doesn't erase people loudly. It absorbs them. It files them away. And once that happens, it expects everyone else to move on. That morning began without ceremony, without warning, without any sense that something old and patient was about to resurface. I unlocked my office, stepped inside, and felt the air before I saw the problem. Silence has texture if you spend enough time around it. This one felt arranged. The folder sat on my desk like it had always belonged there, centered, squared to the edge, deliberate in a way accidents never are. No note. No routing slip. No digital alert. Just paper, waiting. Closed cases aren't supposed to travel. They don't drift upward through departments. They stay buried where memory fades and responsibility thins out. Seeing one on my desk meant a choice had already been made, and I hadn't been consulted. I left it untouched at first. Habit. Or instinct. Maybe both. I hung my coat, poured coffee that tasted like yesterday, and stood by the window watching the city pretend to wake up. Government buildings don't rush. They observe. They let the rest of the world exhaust itself. I'd spent 17 years working inside that rhythm, learning when to speak and when to stay invisible. Cold case unit wasn't where you went to change the system. It was where you learned how it actually worked. When I finally picked up the folder, the paper resisted slightly, stiff with age. Laura Mitchell. Status, closed. 8 years. No qualifiers. No annotations. Someone wanted the label to do the talking. Laura Mitchell had been 34 when she vanished. Financial compliance consultant. A profession defined by precision and quiet pressure. The type of work that rarely makes headlines but often makes enemies who never announce themselves. According to the summary, she left her office near Farragut Square at 9:12 p.m. on a Thursday. Security cameras confirmed her exit. 6 months later, the case was closed due to lack of viable leads. Not solved. Closed. That distinction matters more than people like to admit. Solved cases imply accountability. Closed cases imply fatigue. I read through the file carefully, letting each page settle. Coworkers described her as competent, private, meticulous. Family reported no signs of distress or instability. No sudden financial changes. No dramatic personal conflicts. Her car was located 2 days later in a public garage in Arlington, locked, undamaged, clean. Investigators suggested voluntary disappearance. They always do when the alternative requires effort. People prefer explanations that preserve the idea of order. I kept reading. The reports were thorough without being curious. Detailed without being intrusive. Everything fit too neatly, like a story that had been rehearsed until all the rough edges were sanded down. That's when the timeline caught my attention. Badge log, exit recorded at 9:12 p.m. Garage camera, vehicle entry at 9:04 p.m. 8 minutes earlier. I didn't react right away. Numbers deserve respect. They rarely scream. They whisper, and only if you listen. I checked again. Same timestamps. Same impossibility. Anyone who knows Washington traffic understands what 8 minutes means. You don't steal time like that without help. This wasn't a rounding error or a technical glitch. It was a contradiction. And contradictions don't disappear. They get ignored. I searched the margins for notes, flags, questions. There were none. The discrepancy sat untouched, accepted, normalized. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone had seen it and decided it didn't matter. Or worse, decided it mattered too much. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, listening to the building hum around me. Cold cases don't stay cold because there's nothing left to find. They stay cold because finding things becomes inconvenient. I turned to the witness list, expecting nothing. Security staff. Neighbors. Coworkers. Predictable. Then I saw the entry that shifted the room. Night janitor. Statement taken. No follow-up required. That phrase has always irritated me. It pretends certainty exists where it never does. I read the statement slowly. The janitor recalled seeing Laura earlier that evening near the elevators. She wasn't alone. She was speaking with a man. Calm. Controlled. Professional. No raised voices. No visible distress. That detail mattered. It meant she wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. She was listening. The man wasn't described clearly. Well-dressed. Confident. Unremarkable. The kind of presence that doesn't trigger alarms. The statement was buried deep in the file, far from the summary, far from the narrative investigators preferred. There was no follow-up interview. No attempt to identify the man. No sketch. No cross-reference. You don't overlook a witness like that accidentally. You overlook them because acknowledging them fractures the story you're trying to preserve. I closed the folder and sat there, letting the implications settle. Whoever that man was, he existed outside the record by design. That usually means he existed inside something larger. I left the office without filing anything. Farragut Square looked harmless in daylight, busy with routines and deadlines. Laura's building blended in seamlessly, glass and steel designed to avoid attention. Inside, the lobby smelled of polish and recycled air. The cameras were positioned correctly, but not helpfully. That difference is important. I stood where the footage showed her exiting. If it was her. The angle obscured just enough to protect ambiguity. Not broken. Not negligent. Convenient. I followed the path she would have taken outside, noting where sightlines failed and reflections distorted reality. At 9:12 p.m., the city would have been alert but disengaged. Enough people around to avoid suspicion. Enough anonymity to erase memory. Quiet redirections thrive in those conditions. I drove to Arlington next. The garage swallowed sound the moment I entered, concrete pressing in from all sides. According to the report, Laura's car had been parked neatly, deliberately. No signs of confusion or urgency. Whoever placed it there understood the layout. Understood the cameras. Understood the gaps. Laura wouldn't have. I stood there longer than necessary, imagining the sequence. The car entering at 9:04. The engine shutting off. The driver leaving without hurry. Laura wasn't part of that moment. She had already been removed from the equation. When I returned to my office, my phone vibrated. No number. No message. Just a missed call. That was earlier than expected. I hadn't requested records. Hadn't contacted anyone. Someone was already paying attention. I reopened the file one last time and wrote a single question on a yellow pad, separate from the official record. Who benefits from Laura Mitchell disappearing quietly? The answer wasn't written down, but it was close enough to feel. As I shut down my computer, something else surfaced. The case number format. The sequencing. I'd seen it before. Years ago. Different name. Different circumstances. Same silence. That's when I understood this wasn't a case that had ended. It was a case that had been paused. And someone had just reminded me why. I didn't go home that night because going home implies an ending, and nothing about this felt finished. Home introduces distance. Distance invites rationalization. Rationalization is how unfinished things stay unfinished. I stayed because the case hadn't decided what it was yet, and I needed to be close enough to feel that decision forming. The building around me transitioned into its after-hours state with mechanical precision. Lights dimmed in sections, elevators slowed, the air system adjusted its tone. Washington after midnight doesn't relax. It consolidates. It's when decisions harden into policy and hesitation gets written out of the record. I spread the file across my desk again, not to reread it, but to study its architecture. Cases reveal themselves by structure long before they reveal themselves by facts. Laura Mitchell's file was structurally sound in a way that felt deliberate. Nothing missing that would raise questions. Nothing extra that would invite scrutiny. It had been edited, not investigated. That distinction mattered. I began by mapping what wasn't there, because absence requires intent. No internal dissent. No escalation notes. No alternative hypotheses preserved for later review. In any genuine investigation, disagreement survives somewhere in the margins. Here, it had been erased with care. I accessed internal systems quietly, avoiding alerts, avoiding formal channels. The system remembers everything but explains nothing. Approval trails ended cleanly without commentary. Requests were resolved without rationale. Names appeared once and never again. This wasn't sloppiness. It was maintenance. Bureaucracies don't fail randomly. They fail predictably, and then they learn. I stopped thinking in terms of story and forced myself into sequence. Narrative comforts investigators. Sequence exposes them. Laura worked late. Not unusually late, but late enough to be tired and focused. She left her office floor expecting routine. Near the elevators, someone interrupted that expectation. A man whose presence didn't register as a threat. Calm, measured, familiar with the environment. Someone who didn't need to raise his voice because authority had already been implied. Whatever he said reframed her priorities. That was the critical moment. Everything that followed depended on that redirection. Force wasn't required. Compliance handled the rest. I paced the office slowly, replaying that hinge point repeatedly. Compliance professionals understand systems intimately. They understand escalation chains, reporting obligations, and consequences. Whoever approached Laura understood exactly how to speak to her professional instincts. This wasn't persuasion. It was alignment. That realization narrowed the field significantly. This wasn't a random encounter or an opportunistic crime. It was targeted, contextual, and informed. I returned to the janitor's statement again, reading it as behavioral data rather than testimony. He hadn't described fear. He hadn't described urgency. He had described uncertainty. That mattered. Fear creates memory. Uncertainty dissolves it. People remember danger vividly. They forget ambiguity easily. I examined his employment history in detail. 2 weeks after giving his statement, he was reassigned. Not terminated. Not disciplined. Reassigned. Different building, different shift, different routine. No formal request from him. No complaint on record. That wasn't retaliation. It was displacement. Witnesses are moved when someone wants to reduce the probability of recognition without creating friction. Someone had decided that familiarity was a liability. I documented it privately. Some observations don't belong in systems designed to be reviewed. Around midnight, my phone vibrated again. Same pattern. No caller identification. No voicemail. Silence used deliberately. Whoever was monitoring my activity hadn't decided whether intervention was necessary. That meant I was still within acceptable parameters. I chose not to challenge that boundary yet. The next morning, I submitted a formal request for access to federal building logs associated with Laura's consulting assignments. I used neutral language, standard phrasing, nothing that would suggest urgency or suspicion. The response arrived faster than process allowed. Denied. No justification. That wasn't resistance. That was confirmation. You don't block access unless the information behind it creates exposure. I didn't appeal. Appeals create records. Records create attention. Instead, I shifted focus to physical space. I returned downtown, not to Laura's office, but to transitional zones. Cafes that stayed open late because they had no alternative revenue. Lobbies with secondary exits rarely used during business hours. Loading zones positioned just far enough from main entrances to avoid cameras. These are the places where systems interface with people without documentation. I imagined Laura walking that night, phone in hand, attention split between routine tasks and unexpected conversation. Trust is the most efficient mechanism any system has. Undermine it subtly, and people will self-correct in your favor. I stopped near a loading zone a few blocks from her office. No cameras. Minimal lighting. Just enough room for a vehicle to pause briefly without notice. It wasn't mentioned in the file. It should have been. I stood there, watching traffic flow past without acknowledging me, understanding how easily a person can be redirected without disappearing. Back at the office, I expanded my archival search. I pulled cases closed under similar language. Different victims. Different years. Identical formatting. Identical approval paths. Identical silence. The pattern wasn't criminal. Criminal behavior leaves disruption. This was administrative. Systems don't improvise. They replicate what works. Laura's professional background began to eclipse her disappearance in relevance. She specialized in compliance audits involving subcontractors under federal oversight. The kind of work that doesn't attract attention until it destabilizes structures quietly. 3 weeks before she vanished, she had flagged irregularities. Not criminal violations. Inconsistencies. Adjustments that didn't reconcile. Financial behavior that resisted normalization. I traced the subcontractor, then the contractor above them, then the overseeing agency. Each layer diffused responsibility upward. By the time I reached the top, accountability dissolved into policy language and procedural ambiguity. That's when the closure decision made sense. Solving the case would have required questions that didn't stop at convenient boundaries. Closing it restored equilibrium. Late that night, as I prepared to leave, an envelope appeared on my desk. No markings. Inside was a photocopy of a transfer order from 6 years earlier. Different name. Different case. Same formatting. Same approval chain. Same silence. It wasn't a warning. It was context. Laura Mitchell wasn't an anomaly. She was part of an established process. And now that I had recognized the pattern, the system wouldn't ask whether I should be stopped. It would decide how to adapt. I didn't take the envelope home with me. I learned a long time ago that some objects don't like to be moved casually. They leave impressions, not fingerprints. I locked it in a drawer beneath my desk, not because it was safer there, but because it placed the decision back where it belonged. On my side of the table. That night I finally left the building after midnight, stepping into a city that looked unchanged but felt alerted. Washington doesn't react quickly. It adjusts slowly, subtly, like a muscle tensing before movement. I drove without music, without the radio, letting the sound of the engine and tires fill the space where thoughts usually echo. When systems notice you, they don't rush to confrontation. They wait to see what you'll do next. I made sure my next move looked ordinary. The following days were deliberately uneventful. I didn't file new requests. Didn't call witnesses. Didn't ask for meetings. I reviewed archived material quietly, the way someone does when they want to be mistaken for busy rather than curious. That restraint wasn't caution. It was calibration. Every system has tolerance thresholds. Cross them too quickly and you trigger defense. Stay just below them and you learn more. During that time, patterns continued to emerge. Not dramatic ones. Administrative ones. The same supervisors appearing at critical junctures. The same phrasing used to justify closure. The same absence of dissent preserved in the record. These weren't conspiracies. Conspiracies require coordination. This was culture. Culture doesn't need instructions. It repeats itself because repetition feels safe. I began mapping relationships instead of events. Who approved what? Who deferred? Who stopped asking questions at the right moment? That's how influence actually works. Laura Mitchell hadn't collided with a person. She'd collided with a workflow. Once that clicked, the rest fell into place with uncomfortable ease. Her audit didn't threaten individuals. It threatened stability. Systems respond to instability the way organisms respond to infection. They isolate, contain, and remove the irritant. Quietly, if possible. Force attracts attention. Redirection preserves legitimacy. That's why there was no struggle. No witnesses. No urgency. Just a controlled transition from relevance to absence. I started to notice small changes around me. Subtle delays. Meetings postponed without explanation. Files that took longer to retrieve than they should have. Nothing overt. Nothing provable. Just friction introduced where none had existed before. That was the system's first adjustment. Not opposition. Assessment. I welcomed it. Friction means engagement. One afternoon, I found my desk repositioned slightly when I returned from lunch. Not moved far. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. That wasn't intimidation. It was curiosity. Someone wanted to know how observant I was. I didn't react. Reaction feeds feedback loops. Instead, I documented it mentally and continued working. That night, the phone calls stopped. Silence shifted from presence to absence. That change mattered. Silence can be pressure, but it can also be recalibration. I knew then that whatever process Laura had been absorbed into was still active. Not operational in the criminal sense. Operational in the systemic sense. It hadn't anticipated scrutiny. Now it was deciding how much was tolerable. I revisited the transfer order from the envelope. Different case. Different year. Different victim. Same administrative fingerprint. That case had been framed as unrelated at the time. A routine closure justified by limited evidence. Looking at it now, stripped of narrative, the similarities were unmistakable. Not motive. Not method. Structure. Timing. The way inquiry tapered off simultaneously across departments. That kind of synchronization doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people share an unspoken understanding of where curiosity becomes liability. I realized then that Laura Mitchell's disappearance wasn't an endpoint. It was a midpoint. A maintenance action taken to preserve equilibrium. That understanding reframed everything. It meant I wasn't chasing a perpetrator. I was examining a reflex. And reflexes don't negotiate. They adapt. I began preparing for that adaptation, not by escalating, but by narrowing my footprint. I stopped leaving notes in obvious places. I memorized details instead of recording them. I spoke less. Listened more. Systems rely on predictability. The moment you stop behaving like an investigator and start behaving like an anomaly, they lose leverage. Late one evening, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed a new file in the system queue. Not assigned to me. Not flagged. Just visible. The metadata matched the same formatting I'd been tracking. Different name. Recent date. Still open. Someone hadn't closed this one yet. That was the mistake. Or the opportunity. Either way, it confirmed what I already suspected. The process was ongoing. Laura Mitchell hadn't been removed because she was unique. She'd been removed because she fit a profile. And profiles don't stop being relevant just because one case is buried. I shut down my terminal and left without accessing the file. Access creates trace. Trace creates narrative. Narrative invites correction. Instead, I walked out into the night knowing the boundary had shifted. The system had noticed me noticing it. The next phase wouldn't be quiet. It would be careful. And careful systems don't make threats. They make adjustments that force you to choose whether you're still inside them or already outside. I understood something important before I ever touched the new file. Systems don't leave doors open by accident. If something appears unguarded, it's because someone wants to see who walks through it. That realization slowed me down more than any warning could have. I didn't access the case right away. I let it sit in the queue, visible but untouched, like a chess piece left deliberately exposed. Washington rewards patience when patience is mistaken for obedience. I wanted to look obedient. The next few days I focused on routine. Closed minor cases. Returned calls. Attended meetings where nothing was decided and everyone pretended that was the point. From the outside, I was doing exactly what I'd always done. From the inside, I was mapping reactions. Subtle things shifted. People who used to stop by my office no longer did. Others lingered longer than necessary, asking questions that weren't really questions. The kind designed to measure tone, not content. That told me the system was still evaluating whether I was predictable. Predictability is safety. Anomaly is threat. I made sure to look predictable. When I finally opened the new file, I did it late, long after normal hours, when access logs blur into maintenance noise. Different name. Different year. Same structure. Same language. Same calm efficiency that disguises removal as resolution. This case hadn't reached closure yet. It was still warm. That mattered. The victim wasn't a compliance consultant this time. Different profession. Different surface details. But the arc was familiar. Late hours. Unexpected meeting. Redirection without struggle. A disappearance that left behind just enough explanation to satisfy paperwork and discourage curiosity. The parallels weren't obvious if you were reading for story. They were unmistakable if you were reading for process. I didn't copy anything. I didn't print. I memorized. Systems track duplication. They don't track memory. As I leaned back in my chair, I felt the shape of the thing I was dealing with more clearly than before. This wasn't corruption in the dramatic sense. There were no villains meeting in dark rooms. This was risk management. Institutional reflex. When certain patterns emerged, the response activated automatically, distributed across departments, justified by policy language so neutral it defied accusation. No one person owned the decision. Everyone participated just enough to claim innocence. That's how systems survive scrutiny. I thought about Laura again, not as a victim but as a variable. She'd identified something that didn't align cleanly with expectations. Not illegal. Just inconvenient. In a healthy system, inconvenience triggers review. In an optimized system, it triggers containment. I wondered how many people had noticed the moment she crossed that invisible line. Probably none consciously. The response would have felt routine to everyone involved. That's the danger. When removal feels procedural, no one feels responsible. I began looking for the earliest signal, the moment the system first reacted. In Laura's case, it would have been a calendar entry, a meeting request, an access query that crossed a threshold. Those moments rarely look dangerous in isolation. They only become significant after someone disappears. I searched logs not for actions, but for pauses. Delays where none should exist. Requests that sat unresolved just long enough to trigger escalation elsewhere. Those were the fingerprints. As I traced them, a familiar name surfaced again and again. Not prominently. Not frequently. Just enough to matter. A mid-level administrator whose role was to coordinate between departments. Someone whose job was to make sure processes flowed smoothly. People like that don't make decisions. They route them. And routing determines outcome more often than authority does. I didn't confront the name. Confrontation creates records. Records invite defense. Instead, I looked at what happened when that name appeared. Meetings rescheduled. Reviews abbreviated. Oversight quietly transferred. That was the mechanism. Not power, but positioning. I felt a shift then, internal and irreversible. Until that moment, I'd been investigating a case. Now I was investigating a system. Systems don't collapse when exposed. They adapt. They isolate variables. I was becoming a variable. That awareness sharpened everything. I stopped working late. I left at predictable hours. I reintroduced small inefficiencies into my routine, just enough to look human. Systems trust humans who appear tired. That night, as I was leaving, I noticed someone waiting near the elevators. Not watching me directly. Not hiding. Just present. Well-dressed. Neutral posture. The kind of person who blends into transitional spaces. Our eyes met briefly. No recognition. No threat. Just acknowledgement. That was enough. I didn't change my pace. Didn't look back. If this was observation, reacting would only confirm relevance. In my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the implications settle. The system had moved from evaluation to awareness. That didn't mean danger yet. It meant preparation. I drove home for the first time in days, knowing it wouldn't feel the same. Home doesn't shrink things once you realize what's at stake. It clarifies them. I understood then that whatever happened next wouldn't look like resistance. It would look like assistance. Offers. Shortcuts. Subtle redirections designed to bring me back into alignment. That's how systems neutralize anomalies. They don't push. They absorb. Laura hadn't been absorbed quickly enough. I was already too far inside the pattern to step away unnoticed. The question wasn't whether I could stop what had happened to her. The question was whether I could trace it far enough to make it visible without becoming the next adjustment. The first offer arrived disguised as help. That's how it always starts. Systems don't confront anomalies directly. They invite them back into alignment. The morning after I noticed the man by the elevators, my calendar updated without notification. A meeting appeared where none had been scheduled. No subject line. No agenda. Just a time, a room number, and a name I recognized from the routing patterns I'd been mapping. Mid-level. Administrative. Unremarkable. Exactly the kind of person who could speak for the system without ever admitting they represented it. I didn't decline. Declining creates friction too early. I showed up on time, carrying nothing but a notebook I didn't plan to open. The room was neutral by design. Glass walls. No windows. Chairs arranged to avoid hierarchy. He greeted me with practiced familiarity, the kind that assumes shared context without confirming it. We talked about workload first. About burnout. About how long I'd been in the unit. He framed it as concern, but concern in Washington is rarely personal. It's functional. Then he mentioned Laura Mitchell casually, as if her name had come up organically. He didn't say disappearance. He didn't say case. He said file. That told me everything. Files are objects. People are variables. He suggested there were newer priorities. More immediate risks. He implied that some things are better left settled for the sake of continuity. He never asked me to stop. He offered alternatives. Transfers. Resources. A path that would allow me to feel productive without being disruptive. That's the trick. You're never told no. You're given somewhere else to go. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. Thinking buys time. Time reveals intent. Over the next few days, assistance multiplied. Access requests that had been denied suddenly went through, irrelevant ones. Data I hadn't asked for appeared in my inbox. Old colleagues reached out unexpectedly, inviting me to collaborate on side projects. None of it was overt. All of it was calculated. The system was testing whether I could be redirected without force. I responded politely. Engaged just enough to appear cooperative. Meanwhile, I narrowed my focus further. If offers were coming, it meant pressure points had been identified. I returned to the mid-level administrator's routing history and expanded the scope. Patterns became clearer when viewed laterally. The same individual appeared whenever cases intersected with federal oversight and compliance anomalies. Not as a decision-maker, but as a facilitator. He didn't close cases. He smoothed them. Smoothing is more dangerous than obstruction. Obstruction leaves marks. Smoothing leaves consensus. I traced one of the older cases tied to his name all the way back to its origin. The initial trigger wasn't a crime. It was a memo. A preliminary concern flagged during routine review. The kind that should have led to a meeting, then a follow-up, then a resolution. Instead, it triggered silence. That silence had a cost, but not the kind measured in reports. People were reassigned. Responsibilities shifted. Visibility decreased. And eventually, a person vanished from relevance. Not disappeared. Repositioned out of view. Laura hadn't been repositioned fast enough. That was the anomaly. Something about her refusal, or inability, to realign had forced escalation. I realized then that disappearance wasn't the primary tool. It was the last resort. Most variables were neutralized long before that point through incentives and fatigue. Laura had persisted. That persistence had made her visible. Visibility is dangerous in optimized systems. I began documenting everything mentally, building a map that existed nowhere but in me. Names. Timing. Language patterns. I avoided writing it down. Systems can seize paper. They can't seize memory without making a mess. Late one afternoon, I received another call. This one had a number. Internal. The administrator again. He wanted to check in. His tone was friendly, almost relieved. He mentioned opportunities. Growth. Stability. He framed them as rewards for experience. I recognized the maneuver. This wasn't negotiation. It was absorption. I told him I appreciated the thought and that I was committed to seeing current matters through. There was a pause on the line. Not long. Just long enough to register. Then he wished me luck. Luck is what people invoke when control slips. After that call, the environment shifted. Assistance tapered off. Offers stopped. Silence returned, heavier this time. That was the second phase. Evaluation had ended. I was no longer being redirected. I was being watched. Subtle indicators confirmed it. Network lag on specific queries. Doors that took longer to unlock. Files that loaded just a fraction slower. Nothing provable. Everything cumulative. The system wasn't pushing me out. It was tightening tolerances. I thought about Laura again, about the moment she must have realized alignment wasn't coming. About the quiet understanding that persistence had consequences. That understanding doesn't arrive as fear. It arrives as clarity. I felt it settling in me now. Whatever happened next would define whether this investigation ended as analysis or adjustment. That night, as I left the building, I noticed the man by the elevators again. Same posture. Same neutrality. This time, he nodded. Barely perceptible. A confirmation, not a greeting. The system wasn't angry. It was prepared. I drove home slowly, aware that the line between investigator and variable had thinned. The next move wouldn't come from me. It would come from them. And it wouldn't look like opposition. It would look like resolution. The system didn't move immediately, and that was the mistake people often make when they believe pressure always comes fast. Pressure doesn't rush. It waits until you adjust your breathing, until you begin to think you've misread the situation. Only then does it act. For 3 days, nothing happened. No calls. No meetings. No delays obvious enough to irritate. My access remained intact. My workload unchanged. On the surface, I was still part of the machine. Underneath, I could feel the tension redistributing, like weight shifting on a bridge before a collapse. I used that quiet to tighten my own margins. I stopped carrying my notebook. I stopped logging thoughts digitally. I reduced my footprint to memory and routine. Systems are designed to track behavior, not intent. Intent lives in the gaps. On the 4th day, the call came from someone I hadn't expected. Internal affairs. Routine check-in, they said. Random audit. The word random means nothing in this city. Random is what people say when they don't want to explain selection criteria. I agreed to the meeting without hesitation. Refusal would have raised questions too early. The interview room was familiar. Neutral colors. Furniture designed to discourage comfort without appearing hostile. The investigator was polite, thorough, efficient. He asked about my workload, my recent case focus, my interactions with other departments. Nothing accusatory. Nothing direct. But every question circled the same point. What I was looking at. Who I was talking to. How far I intended to go. I answered honestly where honesty revealed nothing. Vaguely where clarity would have been dangerous. When he mentioned Laura Mitchell, he did it carefully, as if testing the sound of her name in the room. I responded with procedural language. File. Closure. Historical interest. He nodded, satisfied enough to move on. The interview ended without friction. That was the signal. The system had stopped inviting and started documenting. Documentation is preparation. That evening, I revisited the older cases one more time, not for new information, but for divergence. Systems repeat patterns until something breaks them. In every case I'd examined, there was a moment where alignment failed. A refusal. A delay. A question that didn't stay within its lane. That was the trigger. Not the content of the question, but its persistence. Laura had persisted. She hadn't escalated publicly. She hadn't threatened exposure. She'd simply refused to accept incomplete answers. That was enough. I realized then that disappearance wasn't the goal. Neutralization was. Removal was simply the cleanest method when all others failed. I checked my phone as I was leaving the office. A message from an unknown number. No threat. No demand. Just coordinates and a time. An invitation framed as inevitability. I didn't respond. Response implies negotiation. Instead, I memorized the location and deleted the message. The coordinates led to a parking structure on the edge of the district. Public. Busy enough to be invisible. I arrived early and parked where I could observe without being obvious. The man appeared on time. Not the administrator. Not the observer from the elevators. Someone else. Older. More relaxed. The kind of person who has nothing to prove. He didn't introduce himself. Names create records. He spoke calmly, directly. He said he admired my work. That he understood curiosity. That he'd once felt the same. He framed the situation as a crossroads. Not a threat. A choice. Continue and become isolated. Step back and remain effective elsewhere. He talked about systems as if they were weather. Unavoidable. Impersonal. He said Laura had misjudged the limits. Not as criticism. As fact. I asked where she was. He didn't answer. Silence can be an answer if you know how to listen. He told me some questions collapse structures that people depend on. That stability requires sacrifice. That not every truth improves outcomes. Then he stood and left. No handshake. No farewell. I stayed where I was long after he disappeared, letting the implications settle. This wasn't intimidation. It was clarification. The system had identified me as a potential fault line and offered containment. That night, I didn't sleep. Sleep invites compromise. Instead, I reviewed everything in my head from the beginning. The timeline. The omissions. The offers. The escalation. It all aligned now. The system wasn't hiding crimes. It was protecting continuity. Laura hadn't vanished because she knew too much. She vanished because she wouldn't stop knowing. I understood then that there would be no dramatic exposure, no single document that would collapse the structure. Systems like this don't fall. They shed weight. The question wasn't whether I could bring Laura back. The question was whether I could interrupt the process enough to make it hesitate. Hesitation creates space. Space creates witnesses. Witnesses create memory. And memory is the only thing systems can't erase without consequence. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't confront. I wouldn't accuse. I would document quietly, redundantly, in places the system couldn't reach all at once. The next phase wouldn't be about justice. It would be about persistence. And persistence, I'd learned, was the one thing this system feared more than exposure. The system didn't expect patience. It never does. It plans for panic, for ego, for confrontation. Those are easy variables. They burn fast and leave residue. Patience behaves differently. It settles in, adapts, and waits for imbalance. I didn't change my routine after the meeting in the garage. That was important. Sudden shifts attract correction. I kept my hours consistent. My workload visible. My demeanor neutral. On the surface, I accepted the clarification I'd been given. Underneath, I began the slow work the system had never been built to detect. I stopped thinking in terms of outcomes and started thinking in terms of pressure points. Every process has them. Not the dramatic ones, but the mundane ones. The handoffs no one audits. The temporary measures that become permanent because they function well enough. That's where mistakes accumulate. I focused there. I revisited the cases one more time, but not chronologically. I reorganized them by administrative overlap. Who touched what? When? How often? Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before. One approval chain repeated too consistently across unrelated departments. Not enough to look coordinated. Enough to suggest habit. Habits are where systems get careless. I noticed something else then, something small but telling. In Laura's case, and in 3 others, the closure memos were time-stamped within minutes of each other, despite originating from different offices. That shouldn't happen. Systems slow things down, not synchronize them. Synchronization requires a trigger. Or a script. I traced that timing anomaly backward. Not through case files, but through server maintenance logs. That's where the system made its first mistake. Maintenance windows are assumed neutral. Background noise. But neutrality is where patterns hide best. I found a recurring update sequence that aligned perfectly with those closures. An automated compliance sweep, introduced quietly years ago to streamline interdepartmental coordination. It wasn't designed to make decisions. It was designed to standardize them. When certain conditions were met, it generated recommendations that no one questioned because they arrived formatted as inevitability. That was the mechanism. Not a person. Not a conspiracy. A tool that had outgrown its mandate. Laura's persistence had triggered conditions the tool interpreted as instability. The recommendation that followed wasn't remove. It was resolve. Humans translated that word into action. That translation was where responsibility dissolved. I understood then why no one could answer where Laura was. The system didn't track people. It tracked risk. People were just variables attached to that risk. Once the variable was neutralized, the system moved on. That was the error. Systems assume closure ends feedback. But feedback doesn't end when people disappear. It just changes channels. I began documenting the automation's behavior, not in reports, but in parallels. I memorized output phrasing. Trigger thresholds. Timing intervals. Enough to predict its next recommendation. Prediction creates leverage. The next case in the queue hadn't closed yet. I could see it forming. Same early signals. Same delays. Same quiet redirection attempts. The system thought it was operating unseen. That was its second mistake. It assumed obscurity equaled invisibility. I didn't intervene directly. Intervention would have triggered containment. Instead, I introduced friction. Small delays. Minor clarifications. Requests for justification framed as routine. Nothing accusatory. Just enough to slow the automation's momentum. Systems like this don't handle hesitation well. They escalate when outcomes don't align with projections. That escalation generated alerts. Alerts generated human review. Human review generated memory. Memory is dangerous. I watched the response cascade unfold exactly as predicted. Supervisors began asking why recommendations weren't being implemented cleanly. Administrators requested clarification. The routing patterns shifted slightly. Enough to expose themselves. That was the opening. I wasn't stopping the process. I was forcing it to reveal itself. Late one evening, as I reviewed the latest logs, I noticed a discrepancy. The automation had flagged a case but failed to generate a resolution recommendation. A gap. A pause. That shouldn't happen. Systems don't hesitate unless they're confused. Confusion means conflicting inputs. Conflicting inputs mean oversight. Someone else was pushing back, unknowingly aligning with me. That meant the system's authority was fracturing. Not collapsing. Fracturing. I sat back and let that realization settle. Laura Mitchell hadn't been erased by malice. She'd been erased by optimization. That made this harder and easier at the same time. Harder, because there was no villain to expose. Easier, because systems built on efficiency break when forced to explain themselves. Explanation introduces accountability. Accountability introduces fear. And fear is the one variable no automation handles well. I shut down my terminal and left the office knowing the next phase wouldn't be quiet. The system had made a mistake. Not a dramatic one. A subtle one. And subtle mistakes are the ones that spread before anyone notices they've occurred. The system never collapsed. That was the illusion people cling to when they believe exposure automatically leads to consequence. Collapse is dramatic. Collapse is visible. Collapse lets everyone point and say something went wrong. What happened here was quieter, and far more permanent. Systems like this don't break. They recalibrate. By the time anyone realized something had shifted, the shift had already been absorbed into procedure. The automation I'd traced didn't get shut down. It didn't need to. It was rewritten. Subtly. Incrementally. New thresholds. Additional review layers. Human signatures added where none had existed before. Enough friction to slow decisions. Enough ambiguity to force accountability back into the process. That was the victory, if it could be called that. Not justice. Interruption. The cases that followed didn't end the same way. They didn't vanish quietly. They lingered. They required explanation. And explanation is expensive. Administrators hate expense. Expense invites oversight. Oversight invites memory. Laura Mitchell didn't come back. I never pretended she would. Whatever happened to her had already passed through too many hands to be reversed cleanly. But her absence stopped being invisible. That mattered. The file that had appeared in my queue that night was reassigned. Not closed. Reassigned. A small word with significant weight. Others followed. Slowly. Unevenly. But consistently enough to change behavior. The administrator who'd offered me alignment transferred departments within months. Not punished. Not promoted. Repositioned. The observer by the elevators never appeared again. The man in the garage didn't contact me. He didn't need to. His role had ended when the system adjusted. No one thanked me. No one warned me. That's how you know you've touched something structural. Praise would have created narrative. Narrative invites questions. I remained where I was. Cold case unit. Same desk. Same view. But the silence around me changed texture. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was cautious. That's the most you can hope for when dealing with mechanisms built to preserve themselves. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about Laura. Not as a symbol. Not as a martyr. As a professional who refused to accept an incomplete answer. That refusal was enough to expose a flaw. Systems fear flaws more than accusations. Accusations can be deflected. Flaws require redesign. I never wrote a report about her. Reports create endpoints. Endpoints suggest resolution. There was no resolution here. Only consequence. The city moved on, as it always does. Washington absorbs disruption the way it absorbs people. Quietly. Methodically. But some absences leave residue. Some names change how decisions are made even after they stop being spoken. Laura Mitchell became one of those names. Not publicly. Not ceremonially. Functionally. And that, I've learned, is the only kind of permanence that matters.